Okay, so my name is Borislav Chernev, and I'm presently lecturer in modern European history at the University of Exeter in the United Kingdom. I've previously worked as a lecturer at Newcastle University, also in the United Kingdom, and at American University in Washington, D.C., which is incidentally where this project began as a doctoral dissertation that I began to work on in January 2009. Then obviously writing and research took a while. That was successfully defended in October of 2013, and then I spent the next year and a half transforming it into a publishable monograph under the name of Twilight of Empire, the Brest-Litovsk Conference and the Transformation and the Remaking of East Central Europe 1917-1918 that is forthcoming from the University of Toronto Press in July of this year. And the timing itself is quite good because it's the 100th anniversary of the beginning of the eponymous peace conference at Brest-Litovsk, which resulted in the signing of the first two peace treaties of the Great War, first between the Central Powers, so that's Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and Bulgaria on the one hand, and the newly constituted Ukrainian People's Republic on the other hand, on the evening of the 9th and 10th of February, and the second one, once again, between Central Powers and Bolshevik Russia on the 3rd of March, 1918. So the book itself, in a way, it's a study of peacemaking at the peace conference and its implications in domestic politics across the region of East Central Europe. The definition that I use is the more expansive one, basically the lands between the Elbe and the Dnieper River, so incorporating historic right bank Ukraine, but also focusing on events in eastern Ukraine as well. First World War is seen as this iconic clash in the trenches of the Western Front, and historically the Eastern Front has been less studied, although there are some recent work. So the war in the West is still ongoing at this point until Armistice Day, the 11th of November, 1918. The fighting in the East alongside the Eastern Front enters a lull starting in the beginning of 1917. Obviously, the February Revolution in Petrograd in Russia results in the collapse of the Russian Empire. And once the imperial center is no longer the so-called provisional government which comes to power, is very much intent on keeping Russia in the war. However, as we know, the provisional government is then overthrown by the Bolsheviks in the so-called October Revolution, the seizure of power, the storming of the Winter Palace at the beginning of November, October, old style, 1917, and the Bolsheviks are very much sort of one of the two main promises they make to the Russian people is to take Russia out of the war, the war itself is becoming very unpopular across the Russian Empire. By this point, however, once the imperial center in Petrograd, as exemplified by the person of the emperor, is no longer. Imperial collapse then begins to occur across the mostly the western and southern borderlands of the former, by this point, Russian Empire transformed into the Russian Republic. And of course, for this story, what's going on in Ukraine is even more important. Within a couple of weeks of the fall of the imperial center in Petrograd, the so-called Central Rada, Centralna Rada in Ukrainian, is established. The Ukrainian word Rada, for those of the viewers who may not be familiar, is the same as the Russian word Soviet. So in a way, it's a council of workers and soldiers. But these Ukrainian councils are generally less radical and less dominated by Bolsheviks and other social democrats than their Russian counterparts. And this Central Rada, which emerges in March of 1917, begins to carry out a series of reforms based in Kiev, of course, that eventually result in the promulgation of a number of universals, as they're called, which are basically a sort of manifestos establishing in June of that year an independent, autonomous Ukrainian People's Republic within this hypothetical all-Russian federation that Ukrainians at least want to see established. So by June of 1916, we see the establishment of an autonomous Ukrainian People's Republic that was to be part of a hypothetical all-Russian Republican federation based on the equality of all peoples that used to be part of the Russian Empire. So not just Russians and Ukrainians, but Belarusians, Armenians, Georgians, etc., etc., Kazakhs. So while these developments are taking place, obviously the war is still ongoing in the West. And the Central Powers, so primarily Germany and Austria-Hungary, are mostly interested in signing a separate peace in the East so as to eliminate the Eastern Front and focus on the fighting elsewhere on the Western Front against Britain, France, and from April 1917, the United States, of course, and against the Italians on the Italian front. So while this is going on, again, later on, the Bolsheviks seized power in Petrograd, and immediately on the following day, the 8th of November, 1917, published the so-called Decree on Peace, in which they call for an end of the war on all fronts, and the signing of peace treaties without any annexations or indemnities. And now this is a godsend for the Central Powers because they almost immediately jump on the offer and then eventually ask the new Russian government to dispatch a peace delegation to the fortress of Brest-Litovsk. The reason why this particular town was chosen was because the German high command in the east, the so-called Ober-Ost, was based there. That is today the city of Brest on the western border of Belarus with Poland at the time, known as Brest-Litovsk. And so following the conclusion of armistice negotiations for a couple of weeks in mid-December 1917, the peace conference officially convenes on the 22nd of December 1917. Now, at this early point, it's still strictly limited to the Central Powers on the one hand and by the Russians on the other hand, although the Ukrainian the Ukrainian government had sent a delegation to during the armistice, but the Russians behaved quite rudely to the Ukrainian delegation and signed an armistice without letting the Ukrainians come in. By this point, again, the Central Rada in Kiev had consolidated the so-called southwestern and Romanian fronts into a single Ukrainian front and carried out the so-called Ukrainization of the forces, mostly Ukrainians anyway, who had been part of the old Imperial Russian army that was fighting the Austrians and the Germans in that section of the front. Now, the actual sequence of events in December 1917 is quite complicated, in part because, and this may ring a bell to some of your viewers thinking back to more recent political events in the east of Ukraine since 2014. There's a proclamation of a Ukrainian Soviet Republic by Bolshevik Russian and Ukrainians in Kharkiv in the east of the country on the 24th of December. So from that point onwards, there are two Ukrainian states existing basically side by side. And again, it's obviously a very politically sensitive subject. This sequence of events has been described by Ukrainian historians very differently. For example, Pavlo Hainizhny describes it as the first Bolshevik-Ukrainian war beginning in December. Soldatenko, sort of an older generation Ukrainian historian, describes it as the beginning of the civil war in Ukraine. Civil war or not, there is one indisputable fact which even the proponents of this historiographical explanation will not deny. That is that there are Bolshevik forces sent from the north, so from Russia, to aid these Ukrainian Bolsheviks in Kharkiv, led by Vladimir Antonov Ovsenko, who published a 2-volume memoir in the 1920s of his experience in the Civil War, and he was himself obviously charged with helping these Ukrainian Bolsheviks. He described them dismissively in a coded telegram from the end of December 1917 to the Council of People's Commissars, so the Bolshevik government in Moscow. He described these Ukrainian Bolsheviks as scumbags. So clearly he did not have a very high opinion of them, and without his help they would not have been able to actually move westwards, defeat the forces of the Central Rada, enter Kiev in February, and then counter the Rada, which had to flee to the western city of Zhytomyr. So it's precisely in the face of this Russian aggression from the north and from the east that the Ukrainian delegation arrives in Brest-Litovsk on the 1st of January 1918 and begins enters the peace conference and starts negotiating with the representatives of the Central Powers to sign a separate peace, which is, again, welcomed by German, especially German delegates, less so Austro-Hungarian ones, because, of course, as we know very well, Austria-Hungary also controlled Ukrainian populated territories. Basically, most of present-day Western Ukraine at the time in the Crown land meaning province of Galicia, East Galicia, with the city of Lviv, usually known as Lemberg at the time, as the German name. Obviously, the city of Chernivtsi in Bukovina, as well as quite a large Ukrainian population of roughly 500,000 in part at the time northeastern Hungary, known as Ugric Rus occasionally. So perhaps as many as 4 million Ukrainians within the dual monarchy of Austria-Hungary, but living under both Austrian and Hungarian jurisdiction. But anyway, Ukrainian national culture during the 19th century really developed almost exclusively in Galicia because obviously of Russification efforts in Dnieper, Ukraine, so that Paul Robert Magochi, a very famous historian of Ukraine, has, I think, quite rightly described Galicia as Ukraine's Piedmont. So while the Kiev-based government is negotiating with the Central Powers, basically Ukrainian Austrian politicians, including members of the Viennese Reichsrat, that's the lower house of the Austrian parliament, formed in the so-called Ukrainian club, publish an article in the Stockholm-based Swedish newspaper Svenska Dagbladet in December of 1922, asking for the recreation of a Ukrainian crown land, so Ukrainian province combining all Ukrainian populated territories in Austria, that was to be a recreation of the medieval 13th century kingdom of Halych-Volyn. So there's complications there about having a Ukrainian state recognized as independent because, of course, it would have unredeemed brothers in Austria-Hungary. So the Habsburg delegation is not terribly keen on pursuing this, but the Bolsheviks, certainly the Russian delegation, are not at all interested in signing a peace treaty at the time, headed by Leon Trotsky, Council of People's Commissar for Foreign Affairs. Basically, the Soviet delegation tries to foment a revolution. World revolution is a central tenet of early Bolshevik ideology from the peace conference. Now, one reason why it thinks it may be able to do that is because at the insistence of the Russian delegation of the proceedings of the peace conference, so that's the first such occasion in international relations, so the proceedings are made public. In other words, minutes are kept by both sides. Usually the Germans keep notes in German, or the Austrians on behalf of the others. The Russians keep notes in Russian, and the two sets are compared and released to the world press within days. So they're published and read in Washington, in London, in Kiev, in Petrograd, etc., etc. So that's the first public conference. So one of the important things that I discovered when I was researching the conference is that national self-determination, a concept which we usually tend to associate with Woodrow Wilson and the Paris Peace Conference of 1919. So this discourse actually began as a result of the debates that were taking place in Brest-Litovsk, and the Ukrainian delegation, as well as other political delegations, tried to make the most of this new important concept of national self-determination, in part by demanding at first that they incorporate Ukrainian-populated territories in Galicia and Bukovina directly into the Ukrainian People's Republic, but then once, obviously, the Habsburg delegation turned that down, they were able to actually have a secret promise, which is inserted in a secret clause of the treaty between the Central Powers and Ukraine, that stipulated the creation of a Ukrainian Habsburg crown land, meaning province, again, so breaking up these various administrative divisions between Galicia and Bukovina in particular. The western part of Galicia around the city of Krakow, obviously populated by Poles, who historically dominated the government of the provincial government of Galicia starting in the 1870s. So obviously there's a serious clash between the Polish and Ukrainian national movements about the ownership of Galicia, again, in part because both national movements see Galicia as sort of central to their own Piedmont projects, the recreation of independent Poland, a fully independent Ukraine. And so I see the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk and what I call the emergence of a Brest-Litovsk system and the aftermath as pivotal to modern Ukrainian statehood, again, starting very simply because if the Central Powers wanted to maintain this treaty as more than just a fiction, they knew that they would have to intervene militarily on behalf of the Central Rada, because the Central Rada's own troops were insufficient to combat the Bolshevik advance from the north and from the east. And so a few days after the treaty was signed, in the early hours of the 10th of February, the Central Rada issued identical appeals, public appeals, one to the people of Germany and another one to the peoples of Austria-Hungary, basically asking for military intervention. And both countries comply. The Germans send a very large force, perhaps as many as 500,000 troops. The Habsburgs send in 250,000 strong, so-called Ostarmee, meaning Eastern Army. And so this is often described as an occupation of Ukraine by the Central Powers, but certainly wasn't that at the beginning. For example, one interesting document that I encountered in Austrian archives was the order by the Austrian High Command to this commanding general Alfred Kraus, who was in charge of the Habsburg army, and that was passed down to the ordinary troops, was that, again, the Germans issued a similar decree to their own troops that Ukraine was not to be treated as an occupied territory, and in fact there were Ukrainian troops alongside the German and Austrian troops, and Ukrainian contingents from the Habsburg army actually played a very important part, led by a Habsburg archduke, Ukrainophile archduke by the name of Wilhelm von Habsburg, or as we know him, he had a Ukrainian alias, Vasil Vyshivany. For those who are not aware, means embroidered, because he had a tendency to wear an embroidered golden, yellow and blue shirt, obviously the national colors of Ukraine. And so he's being described as a Red Prince by Timothy Snyder, who published a very good English language biography of Wilhelm, came out in 2008. As far as my interest in this very interesting figure is concerned, one of the things that I focused on with regards to the implications of Brest-Litovsk on Ukraine was a series of Ukrainization policies, three that I studied by the government of the Central Rada, which was in charge of the country until a coup by a general by the name of Pavlo Skoropadsky overthrew it at the end of March and the beginning of April 1918, establishing the so-called hetmanate, which was in effect meant to be a hereditary monarchy based on the example of the early modern Ukrainian hetmans. the Zaporozhye in particular. So this was a much more conservative term. The Central Rada was dominated by socialist revolutionaries. So in effect, a sort of a left-wing government that was yet distinct from the Bolsheviks, which is why, of course, we have this military clash between Bolshevik forces and the agrarian socialist government of the Central Rada. So a type of Ukrainization policy that was made to create a functioning Ukrainian-speaking bureaucracy, for example, to run affairs, because all of the bureaucratic affairs in the former Russian Empire had been carried out in Russian. So it was a mammoth task to actually have a sufficient number of people who could carry out administrative business in Ukraine. So that was a big problem. So it's a type of sort of nationality policy, if you like, that I refer to as national in form, agrarian socialist in content, because the socialization of land was one of the main policies that was carried out. That had an additional nationality aspect in Ukraine, because most landowners were either Polish or of Russian descent, whereas most peasants were ethnic Ukrainians. So again, the expropriation of these big landowners' estates was a major goal for the Ukrainian national movement. And this was very different from what the hetman Skoropadsky tried to do. He tried to restore private property, restore land to these dispossessed landowners, and tried, on the other hand, to establish a Ukrainian national army that would be able to defend the country. Now, he failed in this, in part because of popular opposition to the draft, which was meant to be introduced for the year 1919. And he was also opposed by the Archduke, by Wilhelm, who carried out a series of Ukrainization policies that were very interesting, mostly along the Dnieper River, not far from the old Cossack fort of Sich. And he was in charge of a Ukrainian detachment of Habsburg troops known as Ukrainian Sich Riflemen, Ukrainsky Sichovy Stiltsi, very interestingly, that he was in charge with, and became something of a proto-Ukrainian army, because it was made up of Galician Ukrainians, Austrian citizens. But then also the Archduke recruited a number of Ukrainians from Dnieper, Ukraine. So this became a sort of a proto-army for then a future second Ukrainian national state, so-called West Ukrainian People's Republic, proclaimed in Lviv in November 1918 after the collapse of the Habsburg Empire. And so this state then entered a series of conflicts with the newly proclaimed Second Polish Republic. So a lot of interesting developments there. And I think of this period, just briefly to summarize, between March and November 1918, when we have two separate governments, first Central Rada, then the hetman of Skoropadsky, and both carrying out a number of Ukrainization policies. I think this is pivotal for the long-term existence of a separate Ukrainian statehood, because had it not for the intervention of the Central Powers, the Bolsheviks would have dispensed with any experiments of Ukrainian statehood there and then in March of 1918, whereas in this way, a separate Ukrainian state continued to exist for another 6 months. And a number of years after that, Ukraine was not fully conquered by the Bolsheviks until 1920, 1921. And by this point, again, Lenin and the others have become convinced that nationalism somehow had to be incorporated within Soviet order. And so a Ukrainian Soviet Republic was proclaimed again on a number of occasions afterwards, and then became one of the founding states of the Soviet Union in 1922, in December of 1922. And then the Bolshevik nationality policy of so-called indigenization, Korenizatsiya, is the Russian term used, which was then carried out in the 1920s, from 1923 onwards, basically consisted of a number of, in this case, Ukrainization policies, which in many ways drew on the experience of these earlier Ukrainization policies, the three ones that I examine in the chapter dealing with Ukrainian statehood, chapter 4 of the book. The only really monograph in English is the old one by Wheeler Bennett that I mentioned, The Forgotten Peace, that came out in 1939, so a very long time ago. Now, obviously, at the time, archives were not open, accessible to researchers, and so Wheeler Bennett couldn't really use archival sources. What he did was he went around interviewing the leaders of the various delegations and other diplomats who were still alive for the most part in the late 1930s. But this is very much still sort of the standard reading on the topic. If you want to find out more about Brest-Litovsk in English, that's the only book that really covers the entire conference, and it's very much focused on the so-called Russo-German general dynamics. The Austrians and the Ukrainians are there, but they're not as important for Wheeler Bennett as the Germans and the Russians, in particular Lenin and Erich Ludendorff, one of the German generals who was in charge of the country, along with Paul von Hindenburg, the future president of Weimar Germany between 1925 and 1932. And so really there is only one other short, quite forgotten monograph from 1988 by Stefan Horak, which is specifically dealing with the Ukrainian treaties called the, the Ukrainian Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, that came out in 1988, published by East European Monographs in Boulder, Colorado. But it's largely forgotten. And again, there have been publications in German and in Russian, less so in Ukrainian in terms of monograph length. But obviously not everyone is able to read these languages. And anyway, some of them are quite old, from the 60s and 70s. So I think really it was high time that, a reappraisal of the conference was conducted in English. And again, sort of the timing is quite good that this book should be coming out on the 100th anniversary. I know at least one other scholar, an American-based professor, has been working on his own monograph, but I think that's still far from publication, and he will mostly focus, from what he's told me anyway, on the Polish question and the Baltic question. These obviously are part of my book as well, but in my case, it's a much more sort of Habsburg and Ukrainian book than it is a Polish or a Baltic or a Russian or a German book. So in many ways, these two central chapters, Chapter 3 and Chapter 4, Chapter 4 is the chapter that deals with the Ukrainian aspects of the peace and then subsequently these Ukrainization policies. Chapter 3 is on the so-called Great January Strike in Austria, which I see as a prelude to revolution in Central Europe. But again, a very similar, very interesting combination here, seeing how a popular strike against the war and in favor of peace is very much related to these ongoing diplomatic relations with Ukraine, so that the Austro-Hungarian Foreign Minister Count Ottokar Chernin is cabling the Emperor Karl in Vienna, saying that the Habsburg delegation was pursuing simultaneous peace talks with the Russians and the Ukrainians, but if they were unable to sign peace treaties with both of these states, he says it's better to sign one with Ukraine rather than Russia, because Russia has nothing to export but revolution, whereas Ukraine was supposed to have very large grain and wheat reserves. So that the Ukrainian treaty is occasionally referred to in German language literature as the Brotfrieden, the bread peace, a term which apparently was first coined by the mayor of Vienna, then somewhat disparagingly later on, because Ukraine, as part of this diplomatic economic aspects of the peace treaty, was supposed to export 1 million tons of wheat to Germany and Austria-Hungary. In exchange, then these two countries would provide the Ukrainian People's Republic with the equivalent amount of manufactured industrial goods to the same extent. Obviously, the early economic suggestions and estimates said that only about 50,000 kilos of Ukrainian foodstuffs eventually made it to officially anyway to Austria-Hungary and to Germany. But more recent estimates by Wolfram Dornick and others have actually considerably raised that perhaps as much as 300,000 kilos, so a third of a ton. make their way both legally and illegally from Ukraine into Central Europe. So really the Ukrainian contribution to this, the war effort, the very late war effort of the Central Powers was quite considerable during this period of time. So in terms of main conclusions of the book, again, I think this peace treaty and sort of conflict itself and the two peace treaties that came out of it, the Russian and the Ukrainian ones, their relevance really is more important than the short duration of their existence would suggest. Again, both were abrogated in November of 1918. But certainly the territorial aspect of it, of the treaty, remained. If you compare the borders established at Brest-Litovsk between Russia, Ukraine, and Poland and the Baltic states, which were detached from the Russian Empire, the borders actually resemble the contemporary western border of Russia considerably. So it's, in a way, sort of the territorial legacy of the conference is still there, obviously. Then its importance as a transformative, if you like, historical event is still there in promoting national self-determination, that discourse. It became very important and basically mapping the transformation of East Central Europe from and politics there from imperial to post-imperial, with a much larger focus on popular participation both in domestic and foreign policy, and also on nation building, where previously dynastic empires had held sway, the Romanov, the Habsburg, and the Hohenzollern dynastic empires. Now we have the emergence of nation states like Ukraine. And again, the immediate aftermath of the treaty, this is no straightforward process, again, because of these imperial legacies of the fact that, the western borderlands of the old Russian Empire have been very multi-ethnic, multi-confessional. Again, a large number of Polish and Russian speakers in the territories of the Ukrainian People's Republic. So really, a very sort of difficult period, but I think one that is pivotal, again, for modern Ukrainian statehood, and one that was recognized at the time by both early, political leaders as well as the early scholars of the Ukrainian Revolution, like Pavlo Hrystyuk, who discussed the treaty at some length in his four-volume documentary history of the Ukrainian Revolution, published in Ukrainian in Austria in the early 1920s. So really, sort of a lot of legacies there, and I think more scholars are beginning to appreciate that again, because for a long time it was such a blind spot, certainly in the West. That really sort of a peace treaty and a conference which in many ways transformed the fighting. One thing which it did not do was actually end the fighting in the East. So in many ways the Great War in East Central Europe and in the former Russian Empire really sort of changes from one clash of empires that's fairly straightforward into a much more complicated, messier affair where you still have empires until November of 1918, but you have national movements, Polish, Ukrainian, Belarusian, and others. You have ideological warriors trying to export world revolution like the Bolsheviks. So it's very complicated and it's difficult to make full sense of. So I think hopefully my book will contribute to this reassessment of the way that the Great War ended or did not end, if you like, in the East. So I'm hoping to contribute to this larger discussion of the First World War. Well, at a basic level, again, this very much started as meant to be a reappraisal of Russo-German relations, and as I read more, both primary and secondary sources, I began to realize that that's not what's really interesting about this conference. The Russo-German dynamic is fairly straightforward. Obviously, it is important; it's still there in the book, but I thought that the role of, in particular, of Habsburg policy and domestic developments in the Habsburg Empire, at least as important, if not more. And again, the Ukrainian factor here also very important. And one thing that I try to highlight is Ukrainian agency, because if you read, for example, the minutes of the conferences on policy carried out by Austria-Hungary and by Germany in December of 1917, they discuss all sorts of territorial questions like the Polish question, the situation in the Balkans, the situation in the Baltic. The word Ukraine does not appear once, and I've read the full minutes in German. So it really is sort of the agency of the Ukrainian government, of the Central Rada, which is key here, because it's the Ukrainians who decide to send in their delegation, and then decide after they realize they can't steer this middle course between Russia and the Central Powers, which they originally hoped they would be able to steer, then they orientate themselves towards signing a peace treaty and getting official state recognition by the Central Powers, which follows automatically when the treaty is signed, and a few other neutral countries like Switzerland, for example, also recognize the Ukrainian People's Republic as an independent state. So this is very important. De facto state recognition is one thing, but de jure state recognition is just as important in that Ukrainian statehood, in this case, is legally defined within international law. So I think these were some things that I discovered, which were quite interesting. And again, I think it's always the case when you start with a certain set of ideas, when you start working on a project. And then the more you read about it, the more you realize that, there's more to that meets the eye. And so I think the way the book evolved highlights that. Because it's such a complicated time period, and because of this, I think sort of the ideological baggage, if you like, of Soviet education, and certain practice which persisted into the 1990s. Obviously, this treaty of Brest-Litovsk was seen sort of standard Soviet, both Russian and Ukrainian language historiography was that this was sort of the Ukrainian People's Republic was a sort of bourgeois puppet state of the German imperialism, if you like. So it's looked down upon. In many ways, this interpretation persists. In Russian language scholarship, there's a fairly recent book, 2007, by a Russian historian, Irina Mikhutin, written and published in Moscow in Russian, on the Ukrainian Brest peace, where she says, basically her conclusion is that this was a stab in the back for Russia for some reason. Even though the focus is supposed to be the Ukrainian peace treaty, the conclusion is that, the Central Rada stabbed the Russians in the back by signing a separate peace. So again, it's very controversial in both Russia and Ukraine. I think because there's so much going on, there's such a rich period of Ukrainian history, the Ukrainian Revolution, in particular between 1917 and 1921-22. There's been an explosion in recent years, since 2009 at least, of studies of the Ukrainian Revolution in Ukrainian now coming out by Solotenko, by Heinishnik, and by others as well. And so there's certainly been a lot of research there. But I think one thing that is certainly missing, and that includes in English as well, I was looking for sort of, if you like, a synthesis, an English language monograph of most recent studies, as on the state of the field of the study of the Ukrainian Revolution. There's nothing recent published in English. So I think a future project that I would like to do is to write such a book in English that incorporates the most recent Ukrainian language historiography with my own interpretation. But it would be a massive project and involves a lot more primary and secondary research. So it's something that I hope to do in the future, but it's just a massive project. But again, I think it's Ukrainian history in general and early 20th century Ukrainian history is so rich in a lot of different things. And because of the nature of this, I recently gave a paper at a conference in Warsaw last November on the Habsburg mobilization of ethnicity and the Ukrainian question during the First World War. That's coming out next year in an edited volume, sort of, because there's so many different ways of approaching the study of Ukrainian history. You can do it from the grassroots level. You can do it from the perspective of the imperial establishments, whether in Vienna or in Petrograd, especially during the period of the First World War. You can do it from the perspective of regional elites, for example, the Ukrainian Union or Catholic Church in the metropolitan of Lviv, in particular, Andrei Sheptytsky, a very important figure during this entire period. He was metropolitan, meaning head of the Union Church from 1901 until 1944. So again, a fascinating figure is that one is almost spoiled in having, being able to approach the study of Ukrainian history during this period from a number of perspectives. And so it's certainly been a burgeoning field in both English and Ukrainian language studies over the last 20 years or so. So it's only been going from strength to strength. Reading the news in the last few years, again, I see quite a lot of parallels with what's been going on in eastern Ukraine with the events of 1917. That's why I mentioned the setting up of this Ukrainian Soviet Republic in Kharkiv. And I'm not necessarily the only one to have made this connection. Mark von Hagen, a very good friend and colleague of mine based at Arizona State University, who's written extensively on 20th century Ukrainian history over the last 20 years, published an article in the Süddeutsche Zeitung based in Munich a few years ago in 2014, actually explicitly drawing parallels between the events of December 1917, January 1918, the Ukrainian Treaty of Brest, and the ongoing events in eastern Ukraine, which began in 2014, as we know. So these parallels, I think, are definitely there. But one needs to tread very carefully in such a politically volatile situation, and because it's so emotionally charged. But I think less is more. I suppose the question is sort of why didn't any stable peace emerge as a result of the conference? And I think the reason there is sort of we compare different styles of foreign policy. On the one hand, you have for the most part sort of old imperial chancellery diplomacy as practiced by the German and Austro-Hungarian empires. On the other hand, you have this very new revolutionary policy as championed by the Bolsheviks, who are pursuing world revolution as a result of the seizure of power in Petrograd. And you have a sort of a would-be nation-state like Ukraine that's trying to navigate this very difficult situation diplomatically speaking, and unsure of where its foreign policy priorities lay exactly at the time. And so it's that's one thing that we can get out of that that's perhaps applicable to foreign policy making in the 21st century is that if you have two radically opposing types of foreign policy establishments, then it's very difficult. They're largely talking at cross purposes, even though obviously ideology is less of an issue in the 21st century, but certain types of mostly nationalist-driven ideologies, as expounded not just by the current Russian government but by other regimes, is very difficult to negotiate with them, and sort of very difficult for stable peace to emerge, especially in places like the Middle East, where you have non-state actors or would-be state, like the so-called Islamic State, carrying out a very radical sort of Islamist type of foreign policies that they're very difficult to negotiate with or not negotiate with alternatively. So the question is where does one begin to negotiate with them? Where does one end? Is there any point in negotiating? These were debates that were being held at the time in Germany and Austria-Hungary. Does one negotiate with the Bolsheviks? Does one try to engineer regime change in Russia? Maybe bring back some sort of monarchy that's more conservative? How does one go about it? And again, there are no easy answers. I think so the more we study these questions, the more questions pop up and are left unanswered again, because there are no easy, straightforward answers. Something as complicated as that. Well, I mean, I think it's a much needed reappraisal of the peace conference and its implications, as well as domestic implications, whether in Central Europe, in places like Austria-Hungary, or in Ukraine, or in the Balkans, and how it affected sort of imperial competition and collapse, the transformation of politics from an imperial to a post-imperial nation-state situation across Central Europe, and how difficult it is for actual and would-be nation-states to be either created or consolidated on the ruins of the old dynastic empires. I mean, the reason why I call it Twilight of Empire is that in many ways it's sort of the twilight of a certain type of empire, of these continental dynastic empires. In many ways it represents the post-mortem of the Russian Empire. by formalizing the end of an imperial relationship between an imperial center in Petrograd and the western borderlands, including Ukraine, but also Poland, as well as the Baltic states, as well as Finland, as well as parts of the Caucasus. And in a way, it's also the last major international peace conference of the other three remaining empires, the Habsburg, Hohenzollern, and Ottoman empires are involved with, because they too, in a way, share the fate of the Romanov Empire just a bit later on. And so we have an almost complete transformation of politics in that part of the world. But in many ways is initiated by this press conference, the fact that it's open to the public, the fact that self-determination becomes one of the major points that are debated, the fact that everyone is using it sort of becomes almost like a buzzword across East Central Europe, that everyone is claiming the right for national self-determination, whether it's Ukraine, whether it's Poland, whether it's the Baltic, whether it's Bulgaria, it's pretty much everyone who's arguing that their nation deserves this right. So I think there's a lot more to be said about this peace conference than meets the eye. And again, I think we'll have more studies, whether they're article length or book length, of the peace conference and its implications coming up in the not-so-distant future. And we'll see, obviously, next year marks the 100th anniversary of the two treaties, so I think that we'll see how the two are commemorated, if at all, respectively, in places like Moscow and in Kiev in particular. Should be interesting to see how the Ukrainian government chooses to commemorate the 100th anniversary of what is after all the first peace treaty in the First World War, and Ukraine signed it. So I think it deserves great emphasis in Ukrainian current debates and historiography than it has had so far. So we'll see. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. The archives are there, and most of the archival research for this book actually was done in using Austrian, German, Bulgarian archives, to a lesser extent Soviet archives. I visited the Leon Trotsky's private archive, which is at the Houghton Library in Cambridge, Massachusetts, at Harvard University. There are also available documents in Moscow that I haven't looked at, in part because they've been examined quite extensively by Russian scholars over the last 20 years. The main sort of key historiographical thing there is whether or not Trotsky's so-called no war, no peace policy was something that he agreed with Lenin, or something that he completely thought up on his own. And that's unlikely to be resolved definitively, in part because there was no steady communication between Trotsky in Brest-Litovsk and Lenin in Petrograd, because the wires weren't working properly. So we'll never know. We have Trotsky's account, presumably a private meeting with Lenin, that was no minutes exist for that, so we only have Trotsky's word for it, and a passing remark that Lenin gave in March at a party conference in Moscow. Quite a lot of Ukrainian documents dealing in part, not specifically with Brest-Litovsk, but with this period of the Central Rada that I ended up using, have been published actually in Ukrainian. So there's quite a lot of stuff that's published there. Unfortunately, I was not able to visit the archives in Kiev on that. So I'm sure there's quite a bit on the so-called General Secretariat of the Central Rada. So quite a bit published. And Ukrainian state archives, they actually make some of their holdings available online. For example, the autobiography of Wilhelm von Habsburg, which is housed in the archives in Kiev, is actually available freely on their website. So that they do try to make things more readily available, including online. So that's only to be welcomed, because the more people have access to these documents, and the more likely they are to use them. So that's only a good thing. Okay, well, thanks very much. Thank you. Bye.